Well, there's two ways. You could check first if I is null. For example, you could say if I is not null, in that case, print I. Otherwise, do nothing. So if I run this program, nothing happens. Or I could add here an else statement at the end saying that print ln I is null. So I get some kind of error warning. So this shouldn't happen. So this is one approach. You can check before doing something with a variable, check if it's null. But then the variable is null. Why is it null? Well, we didn't initialize it. So another approach, maybe better, would be to initialize I. So you can say I is a new int, for example, with 33 elements. So now I is a new array with space for 33 ints, but they are all 0. Processing, and Java, I think, initializes the numeric variables to 0. This will be the same thing with float. So if I type here new collection of floats, and I run this, then I have here 33 0.0 values. So this means that even I didn't specify exactly how much is I 0, the system already did that for me. So I of 0, the first element is actually 0.0. This only happens with numeric arrays. If my array was a string array, string, I'm gonna call it S, and S is gonna be a new string array, and now I try to type S of 0, then I'm getting null. If I just print S, you can see now that I have a collection of 33 strings which are all null. They don't contain anything. And I think now this is going to be a clear way of seeing what does this null pointer exception mean. If I try to type S0, so I'm going to take the first string and I'm going to try to find out how many characters it contains. So I type dot length, and now if I run this, this is going to give me a null pointer exception. So this means that I have something S0 which is null, and I'm trying to access a property, or I'm trying to call a method in null. You cannot do this, obviously. So the way to solve this is initialize the variable. Here we initialize S. We made S a collection of strings, but we haven't said what does S0 contain. And by default, it contains null. So if I type here hello, so I have to initialize the first element in this array. S of 0 is hello. And now I print the length of that element, then it's 5. But if I try to print S1, then I get a null pointer exception. So this is something that happens frequently. Maybe you think that you have initialized all the elements in your array, but maybe somehow you forgot some, and then you try to do something with the element and you get this error. This is what it means. This means that you're trying to operate on an object that is null, that has not been initialized. How would you solve this for every single element? So you could make a for loop. So you could say int I is 0 while I is less than s.length. And see that here I'm calling a function of the string type, but here I'm accessing this property length of an array. So this, in this case, it doesn't have parentheses. Okay, so I would have to make s of I is a new, I could make a new string, or I could say that is hello. So I'm gonna make every single string in this collection of strings, I'm gonna make them equal to hello. So now if I print s, I have a lot of hellos, and now I can print the length of any of those elements, for example, of 22. Now I'm not gonna get any more a null pointer exception because s22 was initialized. So it's 5. What other errors can we run into with an array? We would get an error if we try to access an element which is out of bounds. We have only 33 elements. What happens if I try to access element 44? I get an array index out of bounds exception, 44. Here is printing the index of the element you try to access. So the last one element you can access is 32. We have elements 0 to 32. element 33 is already illegal, so this is out of bounds. Same thing happens with negative numbers. So if by accident you try to access some element which is a negative index, you will get the same problem. Array index out of bounds exception -22. This is not valid. This is a very common issue if you're working with a pixels array. We can make an example with that. So if I make here a load pixels to prepare the pixels array, and now I try to print pixels 5000, which should be somewhere in the middle of the screen, because our screen by default is 100 times 100. So what happens in this case? I get a number. This is the color of a pixel somewhere here. If I try to access a negative index, we get an error. If we try to access pixel 10,000, we get an error because the last pixel is 9,999. This works. Why is it 9,999? Well, you have width times height minus 1. By default, we have 100 pixels width and 100 pixels height. So this is 10,000 minus 1. That's the ID of the last pixel in the screen, 9,999. Finally, I'm going to show you the kind of bug which is the most complicated to detect or to solve, because the program works. It just doesn't work as you expect. So if you make here, for example, 4, and we don't need even the setup. I'm going to say here 4, int I is 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus, and I'm going to print the numbers between 0 and 10. Print ln I. So we here get all the numbers between 0 and 10. Now, I could rewrite this as, for example, if I is different from 10. This will still work. I would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10. When it's 10, then it will stop. Because here the condition to keep going is that I is different from 10. Okay, so I run the program, I get the same result. So now what happens if instead of increasing 1 by 1, I increase in steps of 2? Still works. 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. What happens if I run in steps of 3? I'm not going to run the program because I'm recording this video and I don't want to crash it. But it will not work. Why wouldn't it work in this case? Because it will count in steps of 3. So I would be 0, later it would be 3, 6, 9, 12. It ran over 10. It was 9, then it's 12, 15, 18, and it will continue up to millions and millions until you manage to press the stop button maybe, or you force close the program, because it would run in an infinite loop. And you see the syntax is correct, and processing is doing what you asked processing to do. He will just think, oh, okay, if he wants to make an infinite loop, then let's do it. But then it can be harder to detect these kind of errors where the syntax is okay, you didn't forget any semicolons, you didn't mess up with the types, you didn't run into array problems, there's no null pointer exceptions. The program is correct, but there's something wrong in the logic. So something that you don't expect is happening. At least in this case, it's better to always use less than, because it will work with any kind of increment. Doesn't matter if you increase in 1 by 1 or 10 by 10, this will still catch the end of the loop. You could also run into the opposite problem. You could type here the wrong sign. What happens then? Then you don't get an infinite loop. Then nothing happens. You run the program and you're not printing anything and you're wondering why? What's happening? Well, I is 0. Then it's checking, is 0 greater than 10? No, it's not. So it directly skips the whole loop and continues here. So this kind of problem causes less harm. It's not an infinite loop. It will not crash your program, but the behavior will not be what you expect. So you have to carefully study your code and see, oh, I wrote the wrong sign here. It's less than. Another way to mess up this loop would be to type here minus minus, because then it will start counting down from 0 to -1, -2, -3, and it always will be less than 10. And it's again an infinite loop. So don't do that. Be careful with your signs and the increments. Oh, I just remembered one kind of basic error. This is going to be the last one I'm going to show here, is dividing by 0, which is illegal. I think, let's try. I make here int a is 0, int b is 22, and I'm going to print b divided by a. Let's see what happens. You see, you get here arithmetic exception, division by 0. So of course, in this case, it's very easy to spot that you are going to divide something by 0. But sometimes it's not going to be so simple, because what if here you type float a is random between -10 and 10?